So, you just watched that video of elders making fun of young people. It's like, what's the phrase? Okay, boomer. Anyway, I just thought I had to throw in the use of the phrase, okay, boomer. So, oh boy, going a little stir crazy over here. All right. Anyway, the video obviously funny, but I still think a good example. So we're gonna jump into now about culture and language. And language is this crazy fast thing that is just such an insight into not only how we think, but why we think. It's sort of language shows us what we value, and it just tells us so much about um, how a culture treats anything that it talks about, right? So essentially, what I'm saying here is that what we talk about shows what we value, and on the flip side of that, what we don't talk about shows what we don't value. So you've probably heard this saying, um, this common trope that there are all these different words that we can't really translate into English from other languages because we don't have that same concept, or we don't have that same um, idea about what that thing even represents, or stands for, or is. And so this is what's fascinating about language. Even though language is socially constructed, again, these concepts are real in their consequences. If we can't talk about something, it simply does not exist to us. So we don't have a framework, right? There's no like cognitive way of categorizing that particular um, feeling or concept. And so it can't exist if we can't define it, right? And so we might have other words that sort of concept, but we actually, somebody might in a different culture who actually frames it linguistically in a different way. And I think that's what's really the most powerful, interesting thing about culture and language, is that culture shapes and language shapes as a representation of culture the way that we actually experience the world around us. So um, here you can look at this idea of, or this example, sorry, of vocabulary and slang around money. We've got all these different words in our society to talk about money. And so they are represented over here on this green shirt. I'm not sure why someone would print a bunch of words for money on a shirt. But anyway, it's the image that I found. So there are all these different ways that we have of referencing cash, dollars, moolah, money, right? Whatever. So obviously, if we have all these different ways of saying the same thing, it's probably something that we as a society value to a pretty high extent. Um, Whenever I was teaching this class to high school students, I asked them to think of an example of something that we don't have a lot of words, a lot of like slang terminology to describe. And someone was like, reading. And I was like, yeah, that's true. If you think about like verbs, for example, I think the different verbs that we use um, to describe or as euphemisms for having sex, I think that's another really key example that is something that our society values pretty, or we think about frequently, and we think about it in a particular way. Um, but those verbs can be so like vulgar sometimes, aggressive sounding. And so sometimes I think it's funny to try to like think of any verb that you might use to talk about having sex, or not you necessarily, but like this society might use to talk about having sex, and um, instead use that verb to talk about reading. Like I'm gonna I'm gonna smash this book tonight. It's like it's ridiculous because again we don't prioritize reading in the same way. It's not the same kind of activity as as um, in the society. It's not something that's been shown to be like super cool in the media, kind of masculine, right? Like it's just not coded in the same way. So anyway, I thought that's a funny example. Um, we've got metaphors and phrases, right? There are all these different, again, different ways that we can reference the things that we care about. And so I do want you to um, try to think about another. Um, either I'll write this question. I haven't written it on your worksheet yet. I'm going to right now. So either think of something that we talk about a lot, or sorry, I'm taking notes while I'm writing this. A lot, or if you speak another language, or if you've learned about a concept from another culture, you could also write about the opposite here. So something that in English we cannot talk about because we don't have a word for it. And I want you um, to write about what that means about people who grow up speaking the English language. What does it mean that we value, or what does it mean that we don't value? So give the example, and then write about the value connection there. Actually, I'll keep going because I think we have time on this clip. So let me just take this note really quickly. Or something we can't talk about. Okay, so next I want to go over this Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And this has been used in comm theory as well. So this is one of those crossover, like interpersonal comm, sociology, theory. There's quite a bit of crossover there. Sapir-Whorf is basically saying what I was just talking about, that language itself creates ways of thinking. It creates ways of perceiving. Again, it shapes how we actually experience the world around us. And so another example of this is you're going to watch this clip, but one that I think is really interesting is the way that cultures and different cultures across the world approach color. And so, for example, we might see in a spectrum of like red and green, we might see two colors there, red and green. But other cultures might have so many different words for like a bunch of shades in between. Um, and then they actually see the world in that way, right? And again, that goes back to this concept of the natural world around us shaping what we need to describe, what we need to have words for. And so maybe, again, for individuals who grow up in a more desert like climate where there are more reds and more tans and browns and things like that, it might be more significant to them to have a need to define colors in this more sort of nuanced way. Whereas for us, maybe we have more words for, let's see, like darker greens, different colors again that we might experience in nature around us. And of course, we also now live in an era where you can go to the hardware store and and buy shades of white from like eggshell to cream to off-white to white, right? And I think a more relatable example here of how language actually shapes lived experience is thinking about those colors, like that white spectrum, and gender. And so there are actually studies that show that because girls are socialized from a young age to sort of care about decorating, care about presentation, painting their nails, right? Different things like that. Girls see these nuanced differences in color that boys don't necessarily. And it's not just this physiological divide, right? We do know that boys are more likely to be colorblind than girls, but it's also this socialized divide. So based on gender, girls are taught to focus more and care more on differences in color, and boys are not. They're supposed to spend their energy elsewhere. So that's how you get to having Lowe's commercials where you see this like type A woman with her doofy husband, right? And he can't tell the difference between eggshell and cream, and she's looking at him like, "What's wrong with you?" Right? It's because they actually experience seeing those colors differently. He is seeing the same color on these two palettes that she's holding, and she is seeing different colors. And I know it sounds bizarre to think that, but that is actually true because it is socialized into us that that's how we think about color. Anyway, look up more about this if you're interested in color discrepancy between cultures. You'll be able to see different charts, and it's really fascinating. So anyway, that's all because of language, and that's Sapir-Whorf. Um, I want you to watch this video. So this is a YouTube clip. Um, the important part here, I think, is from 140 to 520, but it's only like 7 minutes long. I would watch the whole thing. Um, it's really interesting. It's about how Inuit peoples, there's kind of this stereotype that, like you might have heard this trope before as well, that they have all these different words for snow. And it is true, they describe snow in a lot more detail than we tend to, as people who don't have to deal with all kinds of different snow to such an extent. Um, but the clip I like because it goes into why they might have a need to describe snow differently, but also sort of the linguistic theory behind how they describe snow differently. And it also exposes that kind of like the way that we have glorified that story and turned it into a little bit of a trope. Um, and instead, it really shows the what's really taking place here. So anyway, it's an interesting video. I hope you enjoy it.